Hey, this is Sandy.
And Randy.
And we're here on AT Corner.
Being an athlete trainer comes with ups and downs, and we're here to showcase it all.
Join us as we share our world in sports medicine.
Welcome back to another episode of AT Corner. For this week's episode, we are going to be doing an education episode. But not just any education episode, the first CEU episode of this season.
Oh, I think you're right. We had to see that coming.
Yeah, you know, I feel like I'm working it in almost every episode now. It's becoming more and more of a thing.
AT Corner, feet, reggae horn. Anyway, these CEUs are thanks to Clinically Pressed and Athletic Training Chat. They are super awesome. Make sure you check them out. But they are also sponsoring these CEUs, making them nice and free for you. And the link is in our show notes, as well as a tutorial video of how to get your CEUs on our Instagram. So what are we talking about today, Randy?
Yes, this is going to be a position statement episode because we just got a new position statement within the last few months, and then it's going to be talking about emergency action plan development and implementation.
I feel like we've had a couple new position statements lately.
Man, the NATA's Research Foundation has just been in overdrive. They're
seriously
pumping these bad boys out.
And this is just in time for your fall seasons. Hopefully you already have your EAP, but sometimes you're working things like per diem that you don't have an EAP.
Which per diem was mentioned in the position statement.
Yeah, I saw that.
So that was a nice little segue there.
Anyway, I did interrupt your objectives.
No. So, first one obviously is discussing the NATA position statement on emergency action plan development and implementation. Mm-hmm. We'll identify some strategies to involve stakeholders into EAP development. Mm-hmm. And then discuss some unique considerations for the development of an EAP, because not everyone works in a setting that is super easy when it comes to developing an EAP.
Right. And I think that's what makes it so different for each EAP. It's not a plug and play. It's kind of, you have to figure out what your pieces are for the puzzle. Yes.
And also when we talk about considerations, the position statement was geared, like how it is like written and how the flow goes. They really emphasized a lot of traditional sports, but they did acknowledge that this can still be used in a non-traditional setting. It's just obviously there's still a large portion of ATs that work in traditional settings, right. And this comes up very often. So it was still kind of written in that way, but it can still be used in non-traditional settings as well. Just it would have to be a little more tailored and a little more customized.
Right.
But the idea is the same.
So what is an EAP? Because I did work a job that EAP stood for Employee Assistance Program. So whenever I said EAP...
That's a big corporate thing too.
Yes, I noticed that.
Yes, because
I did notice that.
One of the schools I worked at, it was kind of the same thing where it was kind of like a corporate kind of structure. So yeah, EAP was different for me as well. I feel that.
So what is it to athletic trainers?
Yeah, so the anatomy of this episode. So an emergency action plan is essentially a document detailing the preparations and on-site emergency response of healthcare professionals and other stakeholders to catastrophic or potentially catastrophic injuries in a pre-hospital setting, right? So essentially the idea is everyone understanding what their role is during an emergency before they get to the hospital.
So I thought this was interesting because they actually did detail what catastrophic injury was, and it wasn't specifically to... It was actually a little bit more broad than I thought that it was going to be. Like, I think when you hear the word catastrophic, you think extreme, season ending, but in reality, they're really just talking about an emergent condition.
Yes. Yeah, I know, like because you think about like catastrophic insurance, so you're
exactly that's what I was thinking.
You're thinking of life altering or the worst case scenario, life ending kind of injuries, for sure. I think one thing that was a nice distinction that the position statement said is, remember, the emergency action plan is a component to your policies and procedures. It is not your policies and procedures, right? They kind of outlined it great as the EAP just describes what to do in emergency, like when to call, who are you calling, how are you going to get EMS there, right? Whereas the policies and procedures actually outlines, okay, if it is a heat illness, here are the steps we're doing. Here's how we're identifying it and stuff like that. So I thought that was a nice distinction to help kind of just clarify terms, especially if you're going to start talking to like other stakeholders that may not be healthcare professionals.
Right.
And they may use confusing terminology.
I was actually wondering that if emergency action plan is specific to athletic training or if other professions also have an emergency action plan.
Oh, good question. I mean, technically, like workplaces have like an emergency action plan, but I don't know how in depth it is. Kind of like what we do.
But exactly, like is that an athletic training thing?
That's a good question.
These are the things that keep me up at night.
I mean,
I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Well, no, it does because that's a good question. No, yeah, that is a good question. I feel like emergency planning is such an AT thing compared to like some other healthcare professions.
Right.
Or obviously,
you're on site
for emergencies.
It's so unique because first responders, as far as like emergency medical services, they don't have an emergency action plan for each venue that they could potentially be called out to, such as a private residence. Now, they do. I know that they do meet with various venues.
Yeah.
And have a plan like that, but I wonder if emergency action plan in our capacity is specific to athletic training. But this is a tangent.
But it is a good tangent. It's a good question.
Actually, what also got me on this tangent is that the policies and procedures, like what you were saying, a lot of times I think people do get confused about the difference between an emergency action plan and the policies and procedures.
Yes.
Because you think about like a mental health policy. The mental health policy has everything in it regards to
how you are identifying
exactly what
the referral pathway is.
But your mental health emergency action plan is who you're going to call.
Yes.
What in that community resources that you have.
Yeah.
Like your emergent condition, almost like on your normal EAP, how you have an urgent care or a trauma one or, your local hospitals. That's not the same as your policy.
Yes. It's not dictating the treatment. Or like telling...
It shouldn't say like, for example, like heat and illness. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's not dictating if you're going to use rectal thermometry or not, for example. That doesn't go in an emergency action plan. That goes in your heat illness policy.
Exactly.
And procedure.
All the emergency action plan is this person's calling 911. This person's directing EMS. This person's doing this. This person's doing this. It's not saying necessarily the treatment.
The roles, the equipment that you have available.
How EMS is getting there.
Right.
Too.
How to contact them.
Yeah. What to say.
We're talking about what's in an EAP later.
They don't necessarily describe the components quite like the old one did. Mm-hmm. This is more going towards like, here's how you develop it. Like, here's are the considerations that you have to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I thought was very interesting, when they were talking about the development of the EAP is obviously the recommendation is an EAP should be developed for all sponsored activities. Right. Not just games or in-season practices. Right. So you should be included in off-season practices, conditioning drills and stuff like that. And I think that's a really good point because when you think of an EAP, like, right, in some traditional settings, right, it's like, oh, well, the ATs are always here. And like if you're at the, say, a large D1, right, you're probably going to be at their practice, whether it's off-season or not. So it's not like, oh, well, yeah, duh, of course we're going to have that. Right. But you have to remember all the other settings where an AT's not there. So having an EAP for some kind of off-season game plan or conditioning or something like that is huge for the coach to understand, or maybe an administrator that might just happen to be there. If an emergency happens, oh goodness, what do I need to do? Well,
here's the thing is also the position statement did talk about how your emergency action plan should not be written for only athletic trainers to implement. It should be written so that anyone who picks it up can implement it. That is also something that personally, nothing that the position statement said, but personally, something that I've tried to implement within our EAPs and something that I think is overlooked, I think at other places, is your EAP think, when is someone going to pick this up? It's going to be in an emergency. If it's a big block of text, it's going to be so hard to find what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Right? So the way that I structured our EAPs is I have it kind of like in sections and like a grid. So then there's like, on the left side, it says like call 911. And on the right side, it's the script. On the left side, it says call campus safety. On the right side, it says what you tell them.
Yeah.
On the left side, it says open gates. On the right side, it says what gates to open. So it should be very almost like plug and play for that venue so that anyone who picks it up knows what they're looking at instead of just reading through a block of text in an emergency. Because especially if it's something that needs an AED, you want to be able to find that quickly.
Yeah, for sure. And, I'm probably going to say it again at some point in this episode. Like how I looked at it was like in an emergency situation, like we practice this all the time. We talk about it all the time. We've seen it. We know what an emergency looks like. It's our job. We know how to handle our emotions and how to go in and tackle an emergency situation.
Right.
The administrator that's helping you with the EAP for whatever venue, event, wherever you're at, has probably never really seen one or is probably not really necessarily prepared like we are. So when an emergency happens, we've all seen it where the administrator is trying to do too much or getting frazzled and like moving too fast. It's like, hold on. We're good.
Yep,
we got this.
this.
So yeah, you can see in an emergency situation, they're trying to like dictate an EAP. It could be pretty stressful. Right. So yeah, I like that, right? Making it easier for the EAP to be implemented. And I think that's the important thing is to understand that like the AT is not always there in all settings. So this EAP still has to be executed whether we're there or not. So making sure everyone else who is a stakeholder in this has the tools and is able to execute it fairly comfortably.
Right.
I think another thing kind of going into like the specificity of EAPs and obviously I feel like at this point we're all familiar with the guidance that you need to have venue specific EAPs.
Right.
But this position statement also kind of built upon that and threw in that your EAP should be sport specific as well, especially if you're talking about in terms of traditional setting. I think the idea behind it was that each team could have different access to emergency resources. So the example that the position statement provided was, say, one coach for a team having medical training and they're going to have a different role in the EAP, maybe compared to a coach who has no medical training. So that was their kind of idea behind it. And it makes sense, right? So understanding the personnel on each team to make it somewhat sport specific, I think is important. I think it's difficult because especially if you're at a place where there's a lot of turnover, now you're trying to be like, oh, coach, what do you have experience doing? Or maybe a new administrator, like, what are you doing?
Well, also, I think it depends on if your coaches are first aid and CPR certified.
Exactly. And not all sporting organizations, to my knowledge, require it. Some do, but I don't think all of them do.
Ours, I've been at several places that do not require all the head coaches to be first aid and CPR certified. Yeah,
like I'm pretty sure NCAA, that's a for sure. But I think anything, and maybe high school, but I'm not sure. I could be wrong. Like CIF stuff, but I'm not sure. But I don't think NAIA does, and I don't think community college.
No, I think it's also a state thing.
Yeah. It could be, exactly. It could be a state thing.
I remember just reading the other day something about a state thing. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. But I remember some states might require it and some don't.
For sure. See, so it is definitely very variable too.
Right.
Depending where you're practicing, for sure.
Right. Actually another point on the sport specific emergency action plan, you also might have to include more, like let's say if you have football that's very equipment intensive, you need to bring equipment removal tools.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
Right. Whereas I'm not bringing equipment removal tools to tennis.
Yeah, they're not going to be as useful.
So that I mean, not that football and tennis play on the same field. Soccer, for example.
Yeah.
I'm not bringing my equipment removal tools
For sure.
to soccer, even if they play on the same field.
For sure. Yeah. So that's a good point, right? So you're going to bring different emergency equipment.
Right. So I can see that a little bit more than I think
yes.
the person specific, because you still have roles.
For sure. And I think, that was the example they provided, but I like that one a lot, the equipment one, because it is true. Equipment intensive sports are going to be different than non-equipment intensive sports, for sure.
Mm-hmm. They're even like, when we wrote our emergency action plans, we took into consideration the venues and where the AEDs are. We took into consideration, for example, like if the field was being rented out, or if the court, wherever sport venue was being rented out, we could tell which doors would most likely be locked and which ones are most likely unlocked.
Yeah.
Or which ones are always unlocked, so that so like we have a primary AED and a secondary AED.
Yeah.
And we don't ever include the ones that we have with us.
Yeah.
Because those ones we know we have with us.
For sure.
It's not always that they're there.
Yeah.
Right? So things to consider.
See, did you read ahead? I feel like you read ahead.
I did read this position statement.
Oh, I mean the outline here. I feel like we got an AED component to it.
Oh no, I did not read it.
I like it. But no, that's true. The AED consideration is very important, right? Because that's a very timely thing. So you need to know what equipment you have access to, and if you don't have an AED with you, okay, how can I go get one in a timely manner? Where's the closest one?
Right.
I think another thing that ATs do probably already, but very informally, is the position statement did, recommend that an organization should designate someone as your kind of EAP coordinator, right? So this is going to be someone who oversees the development, implementation, and review of the EAP. And the wording in the position statement was pretty flexible, right? It's not like it doesn't necessarily have to be one supreme chancellor of EAPs.
That is a new title.
Yes, right. It could be, kind of one person that's the role, but obviously the responsibilities are going to be delegated, right? Like again, example of like a large, like a power 4 D1, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. The AT that's assigned to soccer, well, okay, they'll be in charge of soccer's EAP.
Right.
And then
they don't get to be the supreme chancellor of EAPs.
They'll just report to the supreme chancellor. Right. So they kind of lent some flexibility, but I thought that it was nice that they recommend that making that formal designation, right? Because I think that's one thing, especially when we talk about EAPs, is understanding people's roles and having it clearly defined. Hey, this is when it comes to EAPs, here's who I need to be talking to when we talk about the review and stuff like that, instead of kind of like, I think I talked to you. Right. I think that, and again, they did mention that, again, it can be like your team physician, but obviously they're not dealing with it the day to day, right? The ATs are. So that could be a delegated task. So something to consider as you kind of develop EAPs or review them is, okay, maybe we make one person kind of like, hey, we're going to kind of report to you when it comes to our EAP kind of stuff. And I think another thing as we go into the development of EAPs is don't forget those other stakeholders when you are developing an EAP, right? Because again, admin's going to be there, right? They're going to be at the sporting event. They're going to be useful for you, and they're going to need to have a role. So, right,
our admin's role is direct EMS.
And exactly.
Get EMS to me.
And I think that's great, right? They have the keys to everything. They know where everything's at. They have the communications. Right. Also, making sure coaches know what to do. I mean, I feel like that shouldn't be too bad, right? I feel like they'll kind of want to gravitate towards like, oh, well, I'll just take care of the team, right? But making sure that they know that, making sure.
It's also a good place in per diem work. It's a great place to educate coaches. Like, hey, I need you to do this. I've had random per diem jobs that coaches, I've been like, okay, I am going to implement this. Here's my AED. Here's this. And I've had a coach that's like, I'm an Army combat medic. I can do all this. And I'm like, okay, I love that, but I need you to be in this role today if we need it. I've also had random people who want to help, so, if you don't have a big team with you, maybe something like directing EMS or crowd control, those are all roles that you need.
Yeah, for sure. And again, with the coaches aspect, remember, like there's going to be situations where maybe the AT's not there or readily available.
Right.
So a coach needs to be able to understand, I need to activate EMS, even if it's like right there, CPR certified, right?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they can identify when someone needs EMS. So they need to know their role of, okay, who do I call? How do I do it? What do I say? What do we need to do?
Wait, do I call 911 first or do I call campus safety first?
Exactly.
Or do I need to call campus safety? What do I need to tell campus
safety?
Safety?
How are they going to get here? Right? So they need to understand all the components. Obviously, they know how, if they're CPR certified, they can theoretically do CPR, but there's a lot more that goes into the emergency action plan than just doing CPR. And then also making sure that your plan lines up with whatever your campus or whatever the organization's like security or campus police, safety, kind of make sure it lines up with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they have obviously an emergency plan for the campus and how they respond to emergencies. So you can't just be like, oh yeah, we're going to go here. And then they're like, actually, we go this way.
Right. I've had one of my previous jobs, I met with, my co-head and I met with our campus police, and we showed them all of our venues, and then they showed us which access points they have on record that they have talked to our EMS squad.
Oh, that's cool.
EMS squad. And so then with that information, then we went back and we were able to recreate our EAPs and kind of outline them. And then we gave those copies to campus police and they delegated that over to EMS. So everyone had copies.
Oh, that's awesome. And I like that extra part of making sure EMS that is more than likely going to respond, or the one that you're using, understands what the plan is. Because that was going to be my next thing is, trying to get your local EMS on board with what's happening.
Well, it was nice because there we had campus police. So we actually they had their radios went straight to dispatch. Whereas some other places that I've worked, it's only campus safety, which is it's very similar and very different at the same time because of just, police sworn in officers, the whole deal. Yeah. Whereas campus safety, they have a little bit of a different role.
Yes.
So the ability to contact EMS straight through our campus police looked different than how I can do it with campus safety.
100%. And, where I'm at now and where I've been in the past, luckily, again, we have police officers, right? So they're part of the actual local EMS kind of system. So it does make it a little bit easier and makes you feel a little more comfortable with that instead of like a middleman kind of situation or anything like that. So for sure.
Also just being familiar in what their role is.
Yes.
At first, I didn't know that there was a difference between campus police and campus safety until it really came down to, I was actually talking to our campus police, and then they were able to give me a better idea of what their role was, which obviously gave us also an opening for us to talk about our role.
Yeah.
And so then everyone understands each other better. Once everyone understands each other better, then roles are much easier sorted out.
Oh, for sure. And that's all, that level of communication and actually, again, understanding roles reduces a lot of tension and headaches.
Yes.
And tension headaches.
Yes.
So, kind of now that you got it kind of developed, you got that EAP looking great, now it's time to implement and then eventually set up the steps to how are we going to review this bad boy. All right. So, implementation is just as important as what you do to develop it, right? You can develop a great EAP, but if it's not implemented in a certain way, it may not hit the goals you're trying to hit with your EAP. All right. So the one thing that, again, I think ATs do this pretty well, or at least, do their best to get this done
In theory.
What?
In theory.
In theory, is making sure the plan is reviewed and practiced annually. All right. One thing to keep in mind with that kind of practice and review, again, I think ATs, we do a great job of looking at it like, oh yeah, this still works. Here's what's going well. or communicating it to our staff or like our students. But one thing to keep in mind is how often are we including those non-healthcare members of the EAP in that review and practice, right? Like,
not often.
I was going to say, like, how often do you go to your admin and be like, okay, here's, just reviewing, here's what our EAP is, getting their thoughts, or actually having them at the emergency day kind of thing and practicing, right?
Which the position statement did talk about.
Yeah, which it did
bringing in all the
recommend.
stakeholders.
Yeah, for sure, which it did recommend, right? How often does that happen? How often do you talk to the coaches about EAPs? I mean, granted, athletic schedules are just, I think I can leave it at that and everyone understands, right? So sometimes it is hard to get coaches out there, but, it is a consideration, right? Because again, they're going to be a part of it, making sure that they still are comfortable with their role, and if any changes have happened or changes that need, maybe coach isn't like, hey, like I don't really feel comfortable with this role. Like, how can we change it at that point?
I was at a venue per diem. Well, actually, it was a long-term contract that we shared an AED with the pool next door.
Oh.
So every time that I would go to the basketball court to work basketball, I would walk over every single day and make sure that the pool was going to be open and that the person with the AED, the person there knew where the AED was, because it was like a front desk person, so they would like change. It was like different every time. And so then I would go and talk to them and ask where their AED was, and then tell them I was going to be working basketball next door, and that if I needed them, I'd ask, like, can I come over here and use your AED?
Yeah. Oh, nice. It's a good idea.
And that's what per diem implementation practicing might look like. I think so much we talk about this. I really like in the position statement how it talked more about per diem, because I feel like so much we talk about this like traditional setting and in your
like structured
in your like work with your admin and work with people who already like know the plan. But what if you just take a
per diem
random contract and they don't have an EAP?
Which does happen, right? Because a lot of these organizations aren't, I don't want to say forced, but don't necessarily have the regulation that you need to have one, so they don't think about it. Right.
Or even I've asked about an emergency action plan before, and they're like, oh yeah, we have an evacuation plan. Just because that's not something that they are.
Exactly.
It's not in their vocabulary.
Yeah, I've seen that too.
Right.
Yeah, like, what, and that was going to kind of be later on is a consideration is, one of the places I worked, we didn't have our own venue, so we had to go out into the community and rent spaces. And again, some are pretty good with, hey, here's what we do in emergencies and stuff like that. But then again, you're going to get others where you ask, hey, do you have an EAP? And they're like, what's that?
Yeah. Well, actually, I've asked, do you have an AED? And they didn't know what that was. And then they went to go ask someone if they had an AED, and they called it something, like they said different letters, A something. And then they're like, what is it again? So some places just might not even be prepared at all.
They just don't know.
Right.
And unfortunately, they're not really expected to know. Like,
right.
Even though maybe they should in a perfect world, but.
Something that I used to do, because I used to work a lot of per diem work, and there's too many emergencies in per diem work.
Yes.
I used to take a piece of paper and I used to write down, like when I got to the venue, I would write down, write it down so that in an emergency I could either hand the paper to someone or that I could read it, or, whatever. Our exits, our cross streets, like easy entrances, or like sometimes, take note when you're walking in where the fire lanes are and where there should be some places that like a fire truck can park.
Yeah.
That's pretty common everywhere. Like I think it's like regulation.
Yeah.
Or it should be. So pay attention to that as you're walking in. So, that's probably where they're going to be coming from.
Yeah.
I also used to write down where the AED was and the nearest hospitals.
Yeah.
And that was just something that like I walk into the venue. That was like what I would do. And then I'd stick it in my, like at the top of my kit.
Yeah, absolutely. And And yeah, per diem's just, it's a tough situation to be in because it's not so structured.
It is tough.
And
it is tough.
Again, a lot of those per diem stuff is like a lot of youth sports. So again, like just the requirements of those athletic organizations aren't the same as NCAA.
Right.
You know, and the people running some of those organizations, I mean, they're volunteering probably.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't know what you're going to get when you're per diem.
No.
But another thing about including kind of like those non-healthcare members for the EAP is it also hopefully gets them comfortable talking about emergencies, right? The more we can expose them to the idea that things can happen in sport and making sure that we keep talking about their role, hopefully it makes them a little more comfortable. They're not going to be as anxious and just hopefully not panicked, you know, in those situations, so they can execute their role. And hopefully it becomes a little more second nature. Mm-hmm. And especially including them on the practice part, right? They get to see what we do and hopefully they feel a little more comfortable. Mm-hmm. Another one that I thought, you know, makes sense, right? And it's like, yeah, we should be doing this, but I feel like I don't know how often this actually happens, is distributing the EAP annually, right? So
you're right.
Right.
I used to do this. I actually used to send out my EAP, but I think it's hard to implement because I felt like when I would send it out, no one really knew what it was.
Yeah, it's just there. It's in the inbox.
One time I was at a meeting that I announced it, and then I said, we're sending these out. We send them out. But I think other than that, like it's, people get so many emails. I think it's just, but I think if you bring it up in a meeting or bring it up personally, like, hey, I'm in it, or even sports specific, right? If we're talking about sports specific, or if you're talking about venue specific, talk to that person and maybe just send them that one at the time.
Yeah.
This is what you need. Go over it real quick, like in person, rather than it just being a passive distribution, right?
And I think that's the important part, is make sure there's some kind of follow up with it. I agree. I think just sending it via email, I think some people are, right? It's like some of the
newsletters that you get from the schools
that you read like 3 lines of it and you're like, okay, cool, got it. Or you peruse it and you're like, got it.
Right.
All right. Like, I agree. I think, yeah, like if there's like a department meeting that you have an opportunity to chat in, like making sure they got that ahead of time, or letting them know, hey, you're going to get this. Please take a look. Let me know what your thoughts are. Right. Let me know if there's any questions or comments about it. All right. So yeah, I think there should be like a follow-up, or yeah, like you said, like that's again, another great thing. Like again, if you have the staff, like a big, like D1, right, where you're going to delegate that EAP role to everyone on staff. Well, I'm working, track. Well, then I will send the track EAP to the coaches and have a conversation with them. So not just the EAP superior chancellor has to talk to all 22 coaches, right? Like stuff like that. Right. So I agree. I think there needs to be some kind of follow-up conversation to make that really stick. I'm having fun with the Supreme EAP Chancellor. I think that's a great title.
I think the position statement should adopt that.
You know what? NATA Research Foundation, here's an opportunity for you.
You missed your chance, but you still have time.
You can still reprint this bad boy. Just credit AT Corner for that one. Again, I think another thing that ATs do really well, and probably very informally, is performing a daily readiness check of that venue and sport-specific EAP, right? We're always checking our emergency equipment, or we're testing our students to check the emergency equipment. I do that before games.
Or you realize you haven't done it in a couple weeks, and one day you wake up, you are driving to work, and you're like, oh man, I haven't checked our emergency equipment to make sure that our vacuum splints work. Let me do that when I get to work. And then you get to work, and then you try the pump on the vacuum pump, and the very first pump, you end up taking the stick out of the pump and realizing that this is not going to work in an emergency. So then you give it to your husband, who also happens to be there that day, so that you could be taping during football treatments and focusing on your football players, so that your husband can take care of this emergency equipment pump. And then you get to the game and realize that you actually have to use that vacuum pump that day. And no wonder you felt funny driving to work, because yeah, you were probably going to have to use the vacuum splints, and that was probably going to be a time that you needed to use it, but then the pump was broken. So you can put a finger down. That was me.
See, so we all do it. Exactly. That was a great example of a typical day of an athletic trainer right there.
Real true story.
A real true story.
Felt weird going to work one day and was like, maybe I should check these.
Yeah, that pump was jacked up.
Yeah, it was weird.
It was a jacked up
for
pump.
fixing it.
Yeah, what was wrong with that pump again?
It unscrewed, so when I pulled it out,
That's right.
it didn't. There
That's
was
right.
It didn't screw into the actual pumping feature.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, it didn't create the vacuum.
Right.
That's right.
So the
that
stick
thing
just
was
came in and out.
That thing was a bear to fix.
Yes.
If you ever have to take apart the vacuum splint,
Like the old
pump,
pump. It was not the new pump.
it is terrible. It does not want to come off.
And it's very oily.
Oh
and
yeah.
greasy.
Don't do this unless you absolutely have to, because it is a pain to take off and put back on.
Yes.
I'm still confused on how it happened because it's a screw.
Right, it unscrewed
so
somehow.
who knows how that happened? And
Right.
you get it on there, it's on there.
Right.
But
we needed to use it.
Yeah, exactly.
We would have been SOL.
Exactly. So, see, readiness checks.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes into the next line of making sure your emergency equipment is functioning properly. And then again, like we kind of already talked about, is making sure that an AED is retrievable within at least 3 minutes. Right? You got to be
maximum.
able to, maximum. That's what I mean, right? Like that's what I mean. Like that's your max, right? Sooner's better.
Right.
Again, like for athletic training, like it doesn't seem to come up a ton in like traditional settings because most of the time you have the AD with you, right? It's with me. I got it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But there's going to be settings where that may not be the case. Again, per diem, right? Unless you went out and bought your own or maybe the organization that hired you had one, right? You need to know where the AEDs are. And again, like I've been at a traditional setting where we didn't have our own venues.
Or is it locked?
Is it locked?
Is the AED locked?
But we didn't have our own venues, and finally we got more AEDs, but at one time we were somewhat short, so we were relying on the facilities that we're at. So making sure, like, okay, well, where's the AED? How are we going to get it? Mm-hmm. So that is an important consideration. And then again, I think we talked about it again. I feel like ATs always consider this is the access points for EMS, right? We always talk about the scenario of like, well, if a gate's locked, right? Who's got the keys, right? Make sure that person's there. Make sure they know what's going on. But also, is there any construction on the way or on the campus or wherever the venue is that might be impeding this, right? So staying on top of, okay, there's construction, talking to the admin who's also a part of the EAP. Hey, how's this change it, right? Campus police, campus safety. How does this change how EMS is getting to us?
So one of my co-heads, we just had construction and we couldn't get to the football field, and like via cart, and EMS couldn't get there from the street either. So
chopper in.
My co-head sent an email to admin just saying, this is a problem in case of emergency. And they actually responded with a map and EMS access points.
Oh, nice. Did it include a chopper?
Unfortunately, no.
Missed opportunity. See, so many missed opportunities, right? Oh, EMS can't drive in? We'll fly in.
You're going to add helicopter, what are those wings? Helicopter wings? What are they?
Blades, yeah.
Blades?
Yeah, blades.
Wow, I just brain farted. Helicopter blades to my golf cart.
Okay. First of all, that'd be really cool. You know it. So yeah, it's right. Important consideration, right? Because that does happen, right? Campuses, improving things, construction, right? How does that impact our EMS?
There was one time recently that I was going to go over our EAPs with an MSAT class that came over. Mm-hmm. And they were doing like projects. So that morning I got an email, probably like 2 hours before our meeting. I got an email saying that construction was happening on this one road. And I didn't know about it until like that day. So then as we're going over, I was like, this is our normal EAP. However, we just got an email that there's construction happening. So
TBD.
actually, we have to use our tertiary entrance, which is this.
Nice.
Yeah,
But you see, it was accounted for.
Perfect learning opportunity.
Yeah, and it was accounted for. It wasn't like, it's going to be somewhere.
Right.
Speaking of going over EAPs, and this actually, we were talking about this a couple days ago, is prior to events, again, this is recommendation from the position statement, prior to events, right, a pre-event medical meeting should be completed, right? This is what some people know it as the medical timeout.
It says previously known as the medical timeout, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was a new term.
They're trying to... You don't use medical timeout? I use medical timeout.
I very rarely have heard it that way. The only time I've heard about it is football.
You know what? That's probably why, because I use it at football.
Yeah. And
because
it was really from...
It's the meeting between...
Yeah. And I initially knew that one from, I think it was... was it the conference we did in Texas, in Texas, where they talked about, oh yeah, we implemented a medical timeout or something. I can't remember where I heard it, but it was like someone said like, oh yeah, then we started implementing a medical timeout. I'm like, oh okay, that's cool.
So I don't know the background behind this, but I assume because this position statement is including per diem and including non-traditional and including things that are not just college, high school, I think that's why they're probably trying to get away from medical timeout, so it's not sports specific. Pre-event medical meeting. That is just my speculation. I think there's no EBP behind that.
Well, yeah, I agree. I think I'm sure the wording too, like that sounds more professional and healthcare-y.
Pre-event medical
as opposed
meeting.
To the medical timeout.
Yeah, but that sounds badass.
Well, because I said it that way. Now, if I say pre-event medical meeting.
Okay, fine. I'll give you that one.
Pre-event medical Zoom.
No.
See, Zoom doesn't make anything in badass. But again, I feel like we do a good job of this as ATs with other ATs, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a host school, you tend to go to the visiting school and be like, hey, here's what we're going to do. Right, and everyone's comfortable. But I think the idea and what the position statement really recommended is including the admin that's there, including the coaches, the facility staff, and the officials.
It's a little bit hard to do that sometimes because some of them don't want to be there.
Yes, and I think that is a very big limitation to pull a coach aside from whatever pregame stuff. You
are not going to get a coach pregame.
Exactly, right?
You are not going to get a coach pregame.
Exactly, right? So perfect world, yes, the coaches should be included in this, but right, at least going the extra mile of like getting admin involved, right? Getting the facility staff that might be working the game, right? Or the officials, right? Making sure everyone understands, here's what we're doing in an emergency. Which again, if you go over the EAP with the admin that's going to be there, right, this should be just second nature to them. They'll be like, I know, I got this. I got the keys. I know the door. I actually already unlocked it. I'm ready to go. All right. So perfect world, that should be fairly quick and easy. But again, I think that's something that the position statement, hey, like, I think that, goes to like, how can we be better with the medical timeout and not just including ATs? Who else can we maybe include that may be important for it? So something to challenge ourselves with. But yeah, for sure. The coaches, I think, perfect world, yes, but I feel like in reality, that's going to be tough.
Honestly.
Like pulling Nick Saban from his team to like, hey, we're going to talk about emergencies. Come here, buddy.
I think when you are practicing your EAP in front of these stakeholders, I think it's easier to start the conversation.
Yes, agreed.
Such as like when we practice emergency equipment and practice is going. Yeah. And people can see that we're practicing that. Yeah. Or that coaches walk over and they're like, you're saving them again?
The key word there is
again.
Saving. Oh, so, and again.
Oh, okay.
I'm just saying, saving.
I like how we have different keywords.
But you know what? They still make the full sentence. Saving. Again. Duh.
See, that's what I was going to say again, because practicing. We practice it a lot.
For sure. But no, I do like that because you're right. The more they see us do stuff like that, the more they're comfortable talking about it.
But again, that's policy and not EAP.
Yes. How often do you practice your EAP? See, that's a policy.
my students and I in the van ride over to our first scrimmage came up with 4 questions to ask in the medical timeout.
Yeah.
One being, let me see if I remember these 4. One being, if we have to call 911, like what's the process? Like basically, do we contact you? Because we were away. Are we in charge of calling campus safety? Like stuff like that. Process for policy for like spine boarding or not spine boarding,
which big. It's a big one.
Right. Equipment removal if we're removing equipment or if we're not. What were some of they asked you, huh?
Team doc, right?
Team doc was one of them. I wasn't sure if that was part of my EAP.
I think that was the 4 questions.
Okay.
Because they hit them all. I remember they hit them all.
Yeah, so we played Randy. We played Randy's team.
Yes, they did. And shoot. Did we even say this to everybody?
What?
That was I was working football.
For the first time in almost a decade.
Well, first time as a certified and first time in a decade. The last time I worked football, I was a student at our football rotation.
That's crazy.
Yeah, dude, it was like riding a bike though. It took me back. Yelling at guys, get back. Guys, back it up. Ooh, and pushing guys as I'm walking down the sideline. I mean, not like pushing them hard, right?
Wow, those are 2 things that I do not do on the sideline. So
well,
I don't know what football you're working.
Okay, I didn't push them hard. Just like as I'm walking, I'm letting them know, hey, I'm coming.
See, we talk about roles.
As a reminder to back them up.
Yeah.
And back up. Hey, guys, back up. And they're like, oh, yeah. And they scoot back.
I just say, excuse me. And then, I'm sorry, Miss Sandra.
I don't think I'd get that one if I just said, excuse me, though. Especially because, again, I'm like, how I kind of view myself with football at this point is like, I feel like I'm the fun uncle.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I'm there to help out occasionally. Right? Like, oh, Randy, what's up? Yeah, right? Oh, we miss you. Where you been? Guys, I'm still in the gym. I'm always in the gym.
Haven't moved.
Yeah, haven't gone anywhere. Right? But then, like, I'm not like dad, and I'm not like, one of my coworkers who works football who has to yell with them all the time, right? If I had to deal with them, yeah, I'd yell at them all the time, but they're not my headache as much, so I could be the fun uncle.
So those are the 4 questions.
Fun uncle.
Fun uncle. What about after activation of the EAP?
Exactly, right? And I feel like this was in the old one, right? And just really carrying it into the new one is there should be some form of debriefing. Mm-hmm. To just talk about how the EAP worked, right? What worked with it? What didn't? What could we have done better? Or what in the EAPs could be like streamlined? Or like how can we make it more efficient? Or hey, it doesn't have to necessarily be, what the hell happened? It could just be, hey, here's what really worked with the EAP, right? I thought it was really good. Like all this stuff happened really well.
I feel like whenever people think of debriefing, they think of all the things that went wrong.
Yeah.
I feel like it's just human nature to obviously...
For sure. And especially...
just impulsively like go over the things that went wrong.
Especially when you're talking about an emergency action plan, right? You want to make everything about it better. So to make it better, you have to say, well, here's what was wrong with it. Or here didn't quite work as we thought it would. Maybe we should try this. Mm-hmm. So it does kind of take away from that. Oh, well, here's what we actually kind of rocked at.
Well. Yeah.
Here's where the EAP was excellent. Right, so I think that's an important consideration. Right? It doesn't have to be all throw this EAP out, start over. Right, there are going to be good elements to it, and I think another thing that we do have to consider, whether it was truly catastrophic or an emergency situation that didn't go catastrophic, is post-crisis counseling. Right, and making sure all the staff members that were involved have access to whatever counseling they may need, right? Because again, even if the outcome worked out perfectly and everyone's A-okay, right? An emergency is still an emergency. It's still a crisis that is still put on us too, that we have to manage our emotions after.
We actually did an episode on that of adrenaline, the adrenaline dump after responding to an emergency.
Yes. And then also...
And how everyone responds differently. Yeah.
And also, we did a really good episode on that post-crisis counseling aspect of the episode with Andy Paulin when we talked about dealing with death as an athletic trainer and responding to that. So
unfortunately, he's had several personal experiences that he shares and how it was dealt with differently each time.
Especially, and he was able to provide a unique aspect because, he practiced a long time. So he actually saw the change over the decades of how those situations. So it is kind of cool to kind of hear just how that post-crisis counseling just has evolved from when he first started practicing to, where he's at now.
Right.
But I think that is a consideration. And again, it doesn't, I think we could take that extra step and like, hey, it doesn't have to end bad to be like, hey, we should probably think about post-crisis counseling. Even if it ended well, man, maybe someone still might need to talk to somebody. And especially when you consider like, okay, we're not immune to it just because we're trained for emergencies, right? Any AT can experience it, but also thinking about the admin, right? That might be the first time they ever seen something like that. That might weigh on them a lot too.
I just responded recently to someone who passed out and their teammate was freaking out.
Yeah.
Like freaking out. And that was just someone who was out for maybe 2 seconds. It was very vasovagal syncope.
Yeah.
Like self-correcting, self-limiting.
Yeah. The brain's reset.
Yes.
For sure, right? Everyone's going to have a different response. So, like we said, this position statement did touch on the per diem, and I feel like we've kind of touched on it a little bit. And like Sandra has worked tons of per diem over the years, so she knows the struggle and the challenges that per diem
can be.
Yes.
Sometimes it can be great.
For sure. Right.
I have some great stories from per diem. I just share all the other ones.
The horror stories. Right. And unfortunately, the position statement didn't necessarily go fully in depth on, hey, what you should do as per diem, right? They just really emphasize that as an athletic trainer, hey, you should be reviewing an EAP for per diem. But again, right, like depending on the organization, you're going to have a very broad definition of what an EAP is. Like we were talking about, like some places, right, it's an employee assistance program, right? Or like, again, you're going to ask, and some people may have one and like it looks pretty normal to what you're used to. And you're like, yeah, that looks great. And some are going to be like, what's an EAP? Huh?
Right.
And then, yeah, you're going to get the follow-up of, oh, we have an evacuation route. Oh, that's good to know, but not quite the same. So I think kind of like what Sandra brought up is just try your best to understand the venue you're going to be working at, right? Like who are you talking to for this event, right? Who's going to be the contact at the event, right? Where are they going to be during this, whatever event you're covering, right? Do they have a role in emergencies, right? Like I'm sure at some point of them working this event, someone has had to have called 911. So what role did they take in that, right? And does the venue itself has an EAP, right? With like a different organization. So like maybe they're renting fields from a community park. Well, the community park should have an EAP, or like maybe a team uses that park and like they developed one, right? Something like that, right? There might be an EAP that maybe a different organization has used.
So what's our action item?
EAPs rock. I would say the biggest thing is really tie in the stakeholders into your EAP, right? Make sure everyone understands their role, make sure everyone's comfortable with it, and that you're not just on an island and you'll be like, hey, I developed this is what we got, right? Making sure at least everyone has at least looked at it and is familiar with it. I think the EAP is a team approach.
Something that I thought of as an action item was actually the fact that the position statement talks about how you should document who is at your training for the EAP. And I don't know a single person who has documented about their EAP trainings.
Again, a lot of times, I think as athletic trainers, we do a good job of this informally. Like I don't
exactly informally. Like the position statement, I feel like makes it a little bit more formal. Include your coaches. And make sure you document this, and also include what you went over. Right, like what scenarios did you practice? Right, are they also? And that's where like we're bridging the gap between like what the quote unquote book or like the article, the position statement says versus like what does that look like in real life. You kind of have to weigh those options. I was just talking to my students today about how I made a decision that I was like, listen, don't take this decision at face value. Like, there were so many things I had to take into consideration when I made this decision, because there's this, and then there's this complication, and then there's this. So don't just think like every single person who walks in with this, I'm going to make this decision. Because any other time I would have said, why did you make that decision? That's a weird decision. Well, because of so many other things that went into consideration.
It's athletics.
Exactly.
Working in athletics.
Unless you don't. Unless you don't work in athletics.
But working with a physically active population presents some gray area.
Yeah. So this is a CEU episode. If you're listening to it as it comes out, it is free for you. So make sure you check out the show notes below. There's links, again, on our Instagram. There is a tutorial video of how to get that CEU, how to register for the course, how to get it for free. At some point, it will not be free, so make sure you also pay attention to that. Again, go to the show notes for the most updated links and everything. Obviously, sometimes podcasts get outdated. I think some of our older ones, we were working with a different CEU provider.
Yep.
So just anytime you're confused, just go to the show notes, or you can always reach out, email us, DM us. If you guys are new, we do episodes of education like this. We do CEUs. We do story episodes where we bring in stories from athletic trainers all over the world, which is the coolest thing ever. And we talk about different topics. We also have a Facebook group that we share various topics to discuss. You can network with other listeners of the show.
Also, I was going to add, in the episodes, no matter what episode, we always do sound effects.
Mostly him.
Yep, that's true.
But anyway, I think that's all I have.
Yeah, and also the chopper noise, that was new.
That's a new one.
That was a new one.
That was a new one. We hope you enjoyed this.
Yes. Thank you for helping us showcase athletic training behind the tape. Bye.